season 8.
So it's fair to say you guys are Larry David fans because Larry David
Oh,
was,
yeah.
he basically was the showrunner for the seasons you like, and then
Yes.
Jerry Seinfeld was more the showrunner for the later seasons, and a lot of credit. I mean, people give Larry David weird kinds of credit, like, oh, Larry David was really the guy and this and that. But people miss also the nuances of what Larry David did for the show. And I'm curious what you think of this. I think what the biggest thing Larry David did for the show, among many, and there's a lot of things, the biggest thing he did for the show, and this was innovative in television, was he didn't want any of the main characters to just be sitting around doing nothing, and he didn't want them to feel bad. So he made sure in every single episode every character had a main storyline, a main through line, and that all the storylines would hook up at the end. So this had never been done before on television with all the main characters. Like on I Love Lucy, Lucy has the main line. Sometimes Ricky has a main line. Rarely, Vivian Vance or Ethel, and rarely Fred. So if Larry David had written I Love Lucy, they all would have had main through lines. Like we would have seen Fred having a problem at work, Ethel having a problem hiding something from Lucy, and on, and then they would all meet up at the end. But Larry David's the first to really do that, and I think as a leader, people don't think of him as a leader because they see his character on Curb Your Enthusiasm, but I think he's the best leader as a showrunner.
You hit the nail on the head. I'm glad you knew that. I mean, that's something he said in interviews, I think. I'm sure you must have. That's maybe what you heard him say that. Or maybe you just watched the show and figured it out. But he definitely made a point to say he felt bad because the actors all wanted something. So he made sure to write them all, like you just said exactly. And my biggest thing with him, and I think it's his line, he's used it. Jerry probably obviously had something to do with it, but really just the show in general is the no hugging rule and the no relationship humor rule. And so, you sport up like The Office and Friends before as like, popular shows with the younger people now. Those are all simple. I mean, I just watched some episode of The Office the other day, and all of a sudden, boom, we're going to switch to these two, whatever their names are, the two that are always in love and they're going back and forth and they're always crying. That never happens in Seinfeld, and that's why it's the best show. It's always just funny. There's no other stuff. They don't need to have, does Rachel and Ross get together? They don't need that. They just go with the funny. And that's why, and he stuck to those guns of no hugging, no crying, no relationship humor. It's just these four people and what the heck happens to them. And that's it. We're not going to fall into this trap of like, we're going to give a hook at the end of the season. Will they get together? Do they love each other? Back and forth. It's like, it's just, I don't know. That's the big thing I take away with him.
I agree. Like the no hugging rule is great. And I used to think about this when kind of the next wave of shows came out, like Beverly Hills 90210 and Melrose Place, which were kind of the more, as I was getting older, the more soap opera-ish. They were, Melrose Place was like starting to be my age, like, oh, is this what my life's going to be like? And, and there was always like a very special Thanksgiving episode for both of them where like deep lessons would be like a lot of hugging would happen, and all the shows just a minimal amount of hugging, regular amount of hugging would happen. But if you think about it, the no hugging rule is sort of like stand-up comedy because often the comedian on stage is playing the persona of a flawed character. Like, this happened to me in my relationship and it's kind of messed up and blah, blah, blah. Like then they say it and it's funny. And so there's, these flawed characters don't learn from their lessons. And I think you're right. That was a great insight of the show Seinfeld, that it's more like real life this way. With the no hugging. And then, another thing Larry David did that I think is underappreciated is that every year he would basically, it was very focused on initially on these crazy New York moments that Larry David had experienced. But there's only so many things you experience in life. So every year he would more or less fire almost all the writers and bring in a new slate of writers from New York to have their own New York experiences. So like I talked to Fred Stoller about this, who was a writer on one season, and he did his season, he shared his New York experiences, and then he was gone, and then there was the next set of writers, and some of those writers survived into Curb Your Enthusiasm. But it's interesting. I think he is interesting. Someone should write a book like the leadership techniques of Larry David. Like it's a good article or book. But I mean, I was actually really interested in Curb Your Enthusiasm, and I think that's why I know the Larry David stuff is because that to me is like one of the most brilliant sitcoms ever. I mean, so is Seinfeld, but Curb, I
You put that
feel.
over.
Hmm?
You put that you rank Curb over Seinfeld?
It's hard to say. Like, do you count, Roger Federer as a better tennis player than Arthur Ashe? Certainly, if they were playing today, let's say they were both at their peaks today, then Roger Federer would destroy Arthur Ashe. But because it was a different game, and it was a different approach to the game. So it's the same thing with television. Like, Seinfeld couldn't do what Curb Your Enthusiasm does. Just like, I Love Lucy couldn't do what Seinfeld did. So it's just a different game. I don't know whether I would. I personally enjoy Curb Your Enthusiasm better, just like Roger Federer would destroy Arthur Ashe right now. But that doesn't. You have to figure out how you're defining what's better or not.
Yeah, because we get asked that a lot about Curb and Seinfeld, and I've thought about it. The thing that I think what Curb does, because Curb isn't scripted, right? There's no dialogue written.
Right.
So they're taking a huge risk, right? That's like probably the biggest risk you can take, is just to start talking and hopefully something comes out that's funny and, gets the story moving and gets a laugh. Whereas you're writing it, Jerry and Larry sit there with the writers and they can write every word to make sure it gets a laugh. And the writing is so good. So like you said, compare the two is so hard, because when Curb is not better to me because it misses sometimes because it's not written. So the story's better, the premise is better, let's say from a comedy standpoint, right? The setup is better, the premise is better, but the punchline might not hit because you're relying on someone to ad-lib the punchline, right?
Right, and I think. Also, Curb is in that golden age we were talking about earlier, where there was arcs to every season. Like, there was the season about doing a Seinfeld reunion, for instance. The whole season's about that, and he's trying to get Cheryl back. But it's almost like comparing apples and oranges. So it's hard to say. I'd say Seinfeld was more pure sitcom style back then, and for what it did, it was definitely the best. Curb has so many interesting. Like, it's interesting you say it was a huge risk to do what he did. I think with any great idea, the idea seems like a risk, but then the rest of the execution is on reducing the risk. So, for instance, how do you reduce the risk for Curb? Let's say you have this idea. I'm going to make an outline, and then everybody's going to improv. Well, how do you reduce the risk? Let's just hire improv specialists, people who came out of Second City or the Groundlings or Upright Citizens Brigade. Let's hire the best improv people in the world, throw them in these scenes, and we've reduced risk because we know that they're the best improv players in the world. And so I think with every risk like that, what makes something great, what makes Larry David great, is how he reduces the risk rather than the initial idea. So Seinfeld, a show with no hugging, what the way they were able to reduce the risk of that, because that was innovative, was to have Larry David writing the scripts. So he had a funny way of not, he'll go, right, he has some classic jokes, like he'll get on stage and say, what's the deal with Hitler and magicians? And it's like such an absurd thing that it's very easy to take personally, if you're the type of person to get triggered like that. And yet, he was good at kind of immersing himself in those situations and then digging out of them. That's how he reduced the risk of no hugging, is that he knew how to dig himself out of these awkward, weird situations.